Hello. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kira Parrott, and I am the director here at Darien Library, and it is my... Thank you. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, the first event in our brand new Presidents Series. In just a moment, I'm going to invite up our eponymous board president, Hutch Pegler, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the series, but I just wanted to go over a few items for this evening. First is that after our guest speaker's lecture, we are going to be doing a Q&A, a question and answer period. So when you checked in earlier, you should have received a little index card and hopefully something to write with. So you can use that to write down a question for our expert, Aaron Tur. You might have something top of mind already that you really want answered, or perhaps his talk will inspire something. And then after Aaron's lecture concludes, I'm going to ask everybody to pass their index cards to the end of the aisle. My colleagues will help collect them, and then Aaron and I are going to sit down and have a conversation, and we are going to try to get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. Now, I would like to give a huge thank you to Hutch Pegler, our stalwart president of the Board of Trustees, who is the true genesis of this series. So over the past year or two, many of us, particularly in the library profession, but well beyond, have been talking a lot about intellectual freedom, about the role of the public library, and about the intersection, the very complex intersection of rights and responsibilities. And as a librarian, of course, one of my great passions is literature and information and protecting and advocating for the right to access literature and information. Our board has had many discussions on these topics, and it was Hutch who first said, you know, we really ought to explore this in some depth. And we really ought to give our entire community the opportunity to talk about it and to learn more about it and to hear from some experts. And that was the seed that eventually blossomed into the President's Series on intellectual freedom. Now, if you know Hutch, you know that he is a deeply engaged and devoted community member who has volunteered many, many, many hours of his time over the years in a variety of roles around Darien, both public service and nonprofit. Hutch is a true library champion and advocate, and we are incredibly fortunate to have him at the helm of what is a remarkable, amazing Board of Trustees here at the library. So please join me in welcoming our Prez, Hutch Pegler.
Boy, with those expectations, oh my gosh. Thank you, Kira. Very kind, and appreciate that. And thank you to Pat Sheary and the entire staff of Darien Library for all the work and effort that went into putting this together. And on behalf of that amazing and engaged board, many of whom are here tonight, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome everyone here to talk about the first of our several series, but important, timely, and thought-provoking discussions on one of the most important and pressing issues shaping our nation today. And as Kira said, specifically, threats to intellectual freedom, free expression, and civil liberties in American institutions. My favorite quote on the topic can be found in a July 1722 submission to the New England Journal by an ostensibly elderly widow named Silence Dogood, who wrote, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech." Well, it turns out Silence Dogood was, in fact, a 16-year-old named Benjamin Franklin, who, even in his earliest public writings, recognized the importance of free expression to a well-functioning representative democracy. Sadly, however, many of today's youth apparently find old Ben's notion quaint and outdated. As according to recent studies, and I think we'll hear more about this during the talk, almost 2/3 of college students agree it's at least sometimes appropriate to shout down or disrupt a speaker with whom they disagree. A plurality believes opinions they find offensive from fellow students should be reported to the administration. And perhaps most appalling, more than 1/4 agree it's sometimes acceptable to use violence to stop a campus speaker. And should we be surprised when many of those same students attend schools that implement speech codes and sanction faculty or deplatform scholars who don't comply? In the meantime, powerful book publishers who apparently don't think very much of their audience deploy sensitivity readers to edit older works, including children's classics by the likes of Roald Dahl and Richard Scarry, so as not to trigger or offend supposedly fragile readers. And finally, and this hits home, fringe groups, even in our own community, are actively working to ban books they think other people's high school-age children should not be able to read in Darien. All of that and a lot more is why we decided to launch this series. Darien Library, and in fact all public libraries, play a crucial role in defending intellectual freedom and will always promote and defend diversity of thought, free exchange of ideas, and important community conversations, even conversations that are difficult or sometimes controversial. This is a place where we invite and respect different points of view, and importantly, neither left nor right can use as a cudgel to score political points. Which brings me to another favorite quote on censorship, because it's so rich with irony, and this one's from Ray Bradbury, who upon learning that Fahrenheit 451 had been sensitivity edited, said, "There is more than one way to burn a book, and the world is full of people running about with lit matches." With that, I'm delighted to welcome our very special guest, Aaron Turr, from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Aaron is the Director of Public Advocacy at FIRE, which has served as the nation's leading defender of fundamental rights on college campuses for over 2 decades. In 2022, FIRE expanded its mission into off-campus free speech advocacy and legal defense, and again, importantly, on an ideologically consistent, nonpartisan basis. Aaron is a native of Long Island, New York, and graduated from Vassar College in 2007. He went on to attend the University of Virginia School of Law, where he was a member of the Virginia Law Review. After earning his JD in 2012, Aaron worked as a judicial clerk and then as a staff attorney at the Pennsylvania Superior Court. A former volunteer for the ACLU of Pennsylvania, Aaron has a long-standing interest in defending civil liberties. Let's give Aaron a warm welcome to Darien Library.
Thank you, Hutch. Thank you, Kira, and to the Darien Library for putting on this important series. 2 years ago, in Llano County, Texas, a group of concerned citizens formed a community group to push for removal of books they deemed inappropriate from their local library. They initially complained about 2 series of children's picture books. One was titled, "I Need a New Butt," and is about a boy's journey to find a new butt after discovering that his had a huge crack in it. Several librarians and local commissioners overseeing the library saw no problem with these silly children's books, but 2 commissioners ordered the library to remove them. Now, if things had stopped there, you might say, okay, is this that big a deal? A library removed a couple books about butts and farts in response to citizen complaints. Probably not the end of our democracy. But the thing with censors and people who advocate censorship is that they're never satisfied with an initial small victory. Once they taste blood, their appetite for controlling access to ideas and information only grows. In the following months, more books were removed from the Llano County Library due to complaints, including a book by the renowned children's author Maurice Sendak. Commissioners also ordered the library director to remove books that contained, quote, sexual activity or questionable nudity from the shelves. But this wasn't about merely moving books out of the children's section of the library. It was about removing them from the library's catalog altogether. At one point, the community group gave the head local commissioner a list of dozens of books they wanted removed because that they believed the books were either pornographic or promoted LGBTQ acceptance or critical race theory. The library removed several books from that list, including the New York Times bestseller Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, a book about the history of the KKK, and a book called Spinning, which is a figure skater's memoir in part about coming out as gay. Notice we've now moved from sexual content to books that simply contain an idea or theme that some people don't like. Left unchecked, the censorship only grew worse. The commissioners ultimately voted to close the library for 3 days to review the entire catalog for inappropriate material. The term inappropriate was not defined, and they mostly just deferred to whatever the community group said. Finally, the commissioners dissolved the library board and created a new one, which would be run by the residents who started the book purge. The new board banned library staff from attending its meetings, and soon closed those meetings to the public as well. Again, censorship is a slippery slope. During the second Red Scare, President Truman observed that once a government is committed to the principle of silencing the voice of opposition, it has only one way to go, and that is down the path of increasingly repressive measures until it becomes a source of terror to all its citizens and creates a country where everyone lives in fear. I quote that just to lighten the mood a little bit. But the Llano County story isn't over. Several library patrons sued and argued that local officials had violated their First Amendment right to receive information. I'll talk more about that right a little bit later. And my organization, FIRE, filed a friend of the court brief in support of that lawsuit, and earlier this year, a federal court sided with the library users and ordered the removed books to be returned to the library. Llano County is far from the only place where you'll find a local or state government trying to mold a public library in its image, where government officials are threatening librarians and libraries for having the audacity to carry books they don't like. In St. Mary's, Kansas, a city commissioner tried to add a morals clause to the city's lease with a regional public library. It would require the library to empty its shelves of, quote, racially or socially divisive material, including anything that supports LGBTQ or critical theory ideology or practice. What exactly constitutes racially or socially divisive material? Censors love broad terms like that basically give them carte blanche to censor anything that's remotely controversial. The censorial impulse has become noticeably worse in recent years as political polarization intensifies and Americans have increasingly heated culture war battles over sensitive topics like race, gender, abortion, gun rights. As polarization goes up, tolerance for opposing ideas goes down. We see this happening in so many different areas of society, and it's especially concerning to see it happen in our society's strongholds of free thought and free inquiry. You know the culture war is bad when it comes to the doorsteps of institutions that are supposed to be outside of it, that should be neutral among the warring factions. Public universities, public libraries, book publishers. These are institutions whose highest purpose is, or should be, fostering the values that underlie our democratic republic: free expression, freedom of information, and the flourishing of a diversity of ideas and perspectives. We can't let them be captured or corrupted by narrow partisan interests. We too often take for granted the freedoms we have in this country, freedoms that are relatively new in human history and would only emerge after centuries of repression taught us that there was a better way to organize a society. For most of human history, censorship was the norm, with religious and political minorities struggling to make their voices heard against authoritarian regimes. And you still see that happening in many countries around the world today. In 212 BC, Ting Shu Huan, which I'm definitely not pronouncing correctly, but I went on YouTube and tried to figure out how to do it, and I feel like those videos are never dependable, but anyway, he was the first ruler of a unified China, presided over a period known as the burning of the books and the burying of the philosophers. Book ownership was outlawed, and countless poetry, history, and philosophical texts were destroyed. 40 years later, over in Rome, the Senate ordered the public burning of Greek texts about Pythagorean philosophy because they, quote, might take people's minds away from the worship of the gods. Roman authorities would later order the burning of Christian texts and their authors. Fast forward to the 16th century, when Pope Paul IV commissioned a list of banned titles, the Catholic Church would continue to update over the next 400 years until it was finally abolished in 1966. You might recognize some names that made the list: Galileo, Francis Bacon, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, Immanuel Kant, among many others. America's founders knew this history. They knew that the government control over what we can say and read is a path to tyranny. So the founders sought to end this vicious cycle, not only by adopting a Bill of Rights with a First Amendment guarantee of free speech, but by creating libraries where people could access knowledge on a wide range of topics. Benjamin Franklin built America's first successful lending library in Philadelphia. He wrote that the library provided him the means of improvement by constant study. In 1800, President John Adams signed legislation establishing the Library of Congress. The founders knew that an informed populace is essential to a healthy democracy. It's why the First Amendment protects both the right to speak freely and the right to receive information and ideas. They're complementary rights. It's how we make progress through what the Supreme Court called wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas which discovers truth out of a multitude of tongues, rather than through any kind of authoritative selection. In other words, we must be free to explore, share, and discuss different ideas and reach our own conclusions, rather than have them assigned to us by the government. Of course, censorship didn't end with the ratification of the First Amendment. It would be a long time before the Supreme Court interpreted the First Amendment to be as speech protective as it is today. During the Civil War, for example, censorship of abolitionist literature was rampant in the South. Samuel Green, a free black man living in Maryland, was sentenced to 10 years in jail merely for owning a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Meanwhile, Anthony Comstock, the secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, ruthlessly censored anything he considered obscene or immoral. More than 3,600 people went to jail under his reign for the offense of causing offense. In the wake of this long history of censorship, courts finally began to breathe life into the First Amendment in the 20th century. The Supreme Court would ultimately place sharp limits on the government's power to regulate speech. In the 1989 flag burning case, Texas v. Johnson, the court said, if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. Such judgments, of course, are completely subjective. Not everyone's as easily offended as Anthony Comstock. And there is no principled, objective way to distinguish the offensive from the inoffensive. As Justice Harlan wrote, one man's vulgarity is another's lyric. These principles don't just protect your right to speak freely as an individual. They also imbue certain public institutions, like universities, museums, and libraries, with, for lack of a better term, a First Amendment aura, which protects them against arbitrary censorship. When the government creates a storehouse of knowledge designed to include even unorthodox and unpopular ideas, it has to play by certain rules. Those rules safeguard these institutions' purpose by limiting the government's authority over them. They prevent these institutions from degenerating into partisan battlegrounds. That means the government can't purge a library of disfavored ideas based on the whims of whoever happens to be in power at a given moment. You shouldn't be able to tell which political party is in office by scanning a library shelf. So what's motivating the current wave of censorship? As in the Llano County case, the reasons you often hear have to do with concerns about what children are reading, including concerns that children are being exposed to sexually explicit material. And that's also why you see many of these disputes arising in the context of school libraries. But, as we saw in Llano County and St. Mary's, Kansas, the concerns often extend beyond sexual content to objections to certain ideas or themes about race, gender, and other contentious political and social topics. And as those cases also demonstrate, the fight has moved well beyond school libraries to public libraries and elsewhere in society. School libraries and public community libraries like this one are not the same. Public libraries serve all members of the community, and their collections are generally extensive, providing unfettered access to ideas and perspectives on a wide range of topics. As we've discussed, when the government orders removal of a book from a public library to restrict access to an idea or viewpoint, it violates the First Amendment. And concerns about what's appropriate for minors don't justify restriction of materials for adults. The First Amendment prevents the government from limiting, to paraphrase the Supreme Court, limiting public discourse to what is fit for a sandbox. Now, the issue is a little more complex and nuanced when it comes to public school libraries because unlike public libraries, school libraries exclusively serve K through 12 students. So for that reason, they do necessarily place a greater emphasis on age appropriateness. They may also consider how a book supports the curriculum and the school's educational goals. But in the landmark case of Pico v. Board of Education, a plurality of the Supreme Court held that even public school libraries benefit from that First Amendment aura that protects against arbitrary censorship. Now, when students are in class, that's one thing. School attendance is mandatory in every state, and students are a captive audience in the classroom. So it makes sense for elected representatives to have broad discretion over what is taught in class, taking into account parental and community input. But unlike the classroom, the Pico Court observed, libraries afford students an opportunity at self-education and individual enrichment that is wholly optional. Of course, school and local officials still have some discretion over what goes in their libraries, but you don't need the same level of government control as you do with mandatory curriculum. The upshot is that when a public school removes a book from the library, the key question is what motivated the decision. Was it a good faith determination that the book isn't appropriate to the ability and maturity of readers in a certain grade level? That's permissible. But what if the decision was based on an official's sheer hostility to a certain political view or philosophical idea? That crosses a First Amendment line. One Texas school district adopted a policy prohibiting all of its libraries, including high school libraries, from carrying any materials that reference, quote, gender fluidity. The district defined the term so broadly that it potentially reached the Disney movie Mulan. The school board president admitted the policy was about suppressing, quote, an ideology, a perspective. So school library books get reviewed for different reasons, some legitimate, some not. That's why the Supreme Court in Pico emphasized the importance of pre-published, transparent, unbiased procedures for reviewing these challenges. Call it due process for books. When there's a fair process in place that the school follows, it gives the public confidence that the ultimate decision is based on legitimate factors like pedagogical value or age appropriateness, and not the whims of school officials or a vocal minority of the community. But what we often see is schools disregarding their own policies and abruptly removing books from their libraries under the strain of political pressure. As the culture war has heated up around this issue, we've also seen really disturbing trends of libraries receiving death threats and threats of criminal prosecution. None of this should be a criminal matter. And when it comes to evaluating books, schools should make individualized evaluations of the books in their full context. Schools and lawmakers should avoid sweeping upfront bans on certain subject matter, whether sex, violence, drug use, or other controversial topics and subject matter, because these policies can have unforeseen consequences. Earlier this year, a Utah school district removed a book from some of its libraries, quote, due to vulgarity and violence. That book? The Bible. And we've seen other examples of policies perhaps unintentionally reaching classic works of literature that might have had lasting educational value for students. An Iowa law broadly banned even high school libraries from carrying any book with a description of a, quote, sex act. That led one district to flag 374 books for review, removing from the shelves classics like Ulysses, The Catcher in the Rye, and The Color Purple. Now, parents understandably may want to restrict their own child's access to books, even if they survive a challenge. That's well within their parental rights. So schools can create a way for parents to limit their own child's access to certain books. That certainly doesn't run afoul of the First Amendment. And it would generally be preferable to denying all students access to material that only some parents or community members find objectionable. Consider that in one Florida school district, a single local resident was reportedly responsible for 94% of the book challenges. Now, recent efforts to restrict what's available in libraries have often come from the political right, but it would be a huge mistake to think that censorship is the sole province of one political party. In fact, you only have to go back to 2020 to find titles like Of Mice and Men and To Kill a Mockingbird on the American Library Association's list of the most challenged books, for reasons such as promoting a white savior narrative. On both campuses and in public libraries, we've also seen a surge in attempts to deplatform speakers based on their views. Now, when a public library hosts its own program, like this event, it can pick and choose which speakers it wants to feature. Okay? I wouldn't be able to sue Darien Library if they decided not to have me here tonight. But when the government opens space, such as a library meeting room, for the public to host their own speaking events, the First Amendment applies. It's similar to when the government opens a public park, or a sidewalk, or a pedestrian plaza. These are public forums where Americans have historically exercised their free speech rights. And the government can't eject someone from a public forum just because it doesn't like the views they're expressing. That's exactly what happened in August at a California public library in Yolo County. It's the real name of a county. A private group reserved a publicly available meeting room to host an event titled Forum on Fair and Safe Sport for Girls, but it didn't last long. When the first speaker mentioned the, quote, physiological advantage of male athletes and expressed her opposition to, quote, biological men playing women's sports, the library director said they could not use those terms to refer to transgender women. When it happened again, the library director shut the event down. As Fire told the library in a letter, that violated the First Amendment. The government can't rig an ongoing societal debate by declaring certain words and phrases off limits. And several audience members at the event opposed, they opened it to the public, and there were several audience members there who opposed the speaker's views. They would have had an opportunity to challenge those views during the Q&A. So by shutting down the event, the library director eliminated an opportunity for dialogue. I'm sure that would not happen at Darien Library, right, Hutch? And as Hutch mentioned, we see a similar dynamic playing out on college campuses. Fire's own research shows more than a quarter of students think using violence to stop a campus speech is acceptable to some degree, up from 1 in 5 just last year. And on a range of controversial topics, anywhere from 28% to 71% of students oppose allowing speakers on campus to discuss those issues. At UC Hastings School of Law, constitutional scholar Ilya Shapiro couldn't get through his opening remarks before audience members completely drowned him out. At Cornell, students blasted circus music and yelled at Ann Coulter as she tried to speak. One of the hecklers screamed, "We don't want you here. Your words are violence." But speech isn't violence. Violence is burning someone at the stake for expressing an unorthodox opinion. Speech is the alternative to violence. It's one of the greatest human inventions because it allows us to hash out our disagreements without resorting to physical force. Forcibly preventing others from speaking or being heard isn't an exercise of free speech rights, it's mob censorship. It's a few people dictating what everyone else can hear. Illiberal actors on the left and the right want to limit the range of acceptable ideas in higher education. Faculty are increasingly under fire for what they say in and outside of the classroom. Fire's research shows that attempts to punish faculty for their speech have skyrocketed over the past 2 decades. Around 500 scholars have been sanctioned for protected speech in the past 3 years, roughly the same number sanctioned in the 20 years before that. Is it any wonder that people are losing trust in higher education as an institution committed to the dispassionate pursuit of knowledge? Witness 2 laws and regulations, one passed in Florida and one in California. Last year, Florida passed the Stop Woke Act, which, under the guise of preventing discrimination, presents a list of 8 concepts that faculty may not espouse or advance in the classroom. One example of a prohibited viewpoint is that an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment to achieve diversity, equity, or inclusion. So that means if you're a professor, you might violate the law just by advancing an argument for affirmative action or reparations for slavery. Fire sued Florida and successfully stopped enforcement of the Stop Woke Act, and the state is currently appealing that decision. Meanwhile, we're bringing a separate lawsuit in California. Our suit there challenges regulations requiring faculty to incorporate certain disputed, highly politicized ideas about diversity, equity, and inclusion into their teaching. This includes the belief that race-conscious remedies are necessary to overcome systemic racism. And then ideas such as colorblindness and merit protect white privilege. Model guidelines published by the state warn faculty against, quote, weaponizing academic freedom to inflict curricular trauma on students. So while Florida is banning ideas in the classroom, California is forcing its faculty to endorse them. Because of these regulations, 2 of our clients are afraid to assign Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to Birmingham jail. Others are reluctant to encourage debates on controversial topics such as the death penalty and drug legalization. Both the Stop Woke Act and the California DEI regulations violate the First Amendment. Over 50 years ago, the Supreme Court upheld a First Amendment challenge to state laws mandating loyalty oaths and termination of faculty for, quote, seditious speech. The court memorably stated, "Our nation is deeply committed to safeguarding academic freedom, which is of transcendent value to all of us and not merely to the teachers concerned. That freedom is therefore a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom." The Florida and California laws demonstrate the short-sightedness of censorship. If Florida successfully argued in court that faculty don't have First Amendment rights in the classroom, that they're mere mouthpieces of the state, that wouldn't have just silenced left-leaning faculty in Florida. It would also have legitimized regulations like those in California that force faculty to agree with certain left-leaning perspectives. All these ideas should be subject to academic debate. That's what college is for. So I've been talking mainly about efforts by government actors, state legislators, public universities, public libraries, to restrict speech and access to ideas. But while government repression may be the most serious threat to free speech, it's not the only one. At FIRE, we often talk about free speech not just as a legal right, but as a cultural value. When large parts of the population and powerful private institutions are hostile to free speech, that can severely limit public discourse, and creative expression. Earlier this year, I wrote about 2 comic book creators whose crowdfunding campaigns were canceled because of the content of their comic books. One of them, Mike Barron, used to write for The Punisher and Batman. But he wanted to self-publish a new comic book called Private American, which tells the story of a Cuban-American ex-Green Beret who seeks vigilante justice against human traffickers, drug cartels, and other criminals at the southern border. So he started crowdfunding campaigns to raise money from his fans. Then someone wrote an article on the Daily Kos calling Private American racist, even though it hadn't been published yet, and calling on readers to contact Kickstarter to oppose the crowdfunding campaign. The next day, Kickstarter canceled the campaign, which it had previously reviewed and approved, denied Barron the money he had already raised, and gave him no opportunity to appeal the decision. We see this phenomenon in the publishing industry as well. In response to actual or anticipated social pressure, publishing houses have canceled book contracts, sanitized authors' works after they've already been published, and ceased circulation of books. In March, Scholastic announced it had retroactively edited several books in R.L. Stine's famous series, Goosebumps, to remove potentially offensive and negative language. This apparently was news to Stine himself, who said he had approved none of the changes. The idea that books shouldn't contain anything that makes a reader uncomfortable cannot be squared with artistic freedom or the purpose of literature. The provocative quality of literature is a feature, not a bug. Stories reflect the messy and sometimes ugly nature of human experience. The record producer Rick Rubin said that art can't be wrong. It's a public diary entry. And by the way, these post hoc revisions often strip the life out of the prose. Just take this one posthumous edit to Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. The original line read, "Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach." That was changed to, "Augustus was ignoring everything." Decisions about what content is offensive or harmful are unavoidably subjective. There's no limiting principle. It might start with a few language tweaks, and before you know it, whole ideas are added or removed to the work, contrary to the author's vision. So we've seen that censorship has bipartisan appeal, and how the arguments to justify it on the right and the left can be remarkably similar. How do we escape the censorship spiral? We need to establish the ground rules for democracy. As David French recently wrote, we need a legal corollary to the golden rule. Defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. In a country of 330 million people, you're going to get some very different ideas about how to govern society and the best way to live. We work those differences out through deliberation and the democratic process. We can clash over contentious political and social issues, but we need to do it without limiting each other's freedom to speak, to read, and to access ideas and information. It's not up to any one authority to decide the correct view and turn it into an unchallengeable dogma. It's not up to any one person to decide what is and isn't offensive. 70 years ago, in response to efforts to deny or limit access to reading materials, the American Library Association and the American Book Publishers Council issued the Freedom to Read statement. They wrote, "Most attempts at suppression rest on a denial of the fundamental premise of democracy, that the ordinary individual, by exercising critical judgment, will select the good and reject the bad. If nothing else, those who support censorship should be careful what they wish for, because the political winds often shift. When we protect even the speech we dislike today, we reinforce the principle that protects the speech we like tomorrow." Thank you.
So while we're gathering index cards, maybe I'll start with a question of my own. And I think you touched on this a little bit, but we all have busy lives. We all have got a lot going on. Why do we all need to care about the First Amendment and free expression? And what's the sort of danger, that slippery slope? Like where do you see that ending if we don't sort of take a stand? And what can the people in this room do?
Yeah, it's really something that everybody has an interest in. If you live in this country, as I talked about in my speech, the First Amendment and freedom of speech, it's one of those core underlying values that enables a democracy to exist. It's really the precondition to every other right that we exercise. We can have laws governing conduct, right? But when we don't like those laws, we're always free to vocally oppose them. What happens when you have laws that restrict speech? How do you oppose those, right? So, that's why free speech is so important. And, ultimately it affects everybody's life because when we lose that freedom, I think the best way to think about it is just look around the world at other countries that don't have free speech, right? And look at countries like Turkey that have somewhat recently descended into authoritarianism. The first right to go in those countries is always freedom of speech, because the leaders know that to consolidate their hold on power, they need to crush all dissent, because they don't have good arguments for organizing society the way they want to. And so it's basically rigging the game. It's saying, we're not going to let anyone come out and espouse a better idea, an alternative viewpoint. And that's really the way that we've made all progress throughout our history, right? It's through giving people the freedom to speak, to build on previous knowledge. It's essential to social progress, to peace. I talked a little bit about free speech as the alternative to violence, right? For much of our human history, we worked out our disagreements by having wars, right? And unfortunately, that still does happen, but it's the alternative to violence. We're going to instead let all the ideas and viewpoints clash with each other and let the people decide which ones they think have merit, and which ones are worth adopting. So I think, and as far as what people can do, I think, it's great that everybody came out to this event. That's one thing. I think events like this are very important. to keep these issues at the forefront of people's minds, and also to demonstrate how we can have, engage in dialogue. I'm sure not everyone in this room agrees with each other on everything. I'm sure not everyone agrees with everything I said. But we have this opportunity to talk about it, to take questions, and demonstrate free speech in action and why it works. I also think, people, one thing people can do is call out the illiberalism and cancellations when you see them. I think, we need to have a big movement for free speech that acts as a counterweight to the very, a strong movement in the other direction to censor more, to cancel people for expressing their wrong viewpoints, to ban books from libraries, even bookstores. I didn't get into an interesting case even involving Barnes & Noble. So the more people that we get on the other side to act as a counterweight, the more we can stem the tide of that. But people need to speak up, right? You need to send a message to institutions that there are people also who oppose this stuff, right? Not everyone wants to censor offensive language. And so I think that's the biggest thing people can do. You can become a FIRE member. I'll do a little plug for FIRE here. You can become a FIRE member and be on our list. And we have with our expansion last year, we expanded off campus. We were just a campus outfit for 20 years. We have this new engagement and mobilization team. So, for instance, if there's an embattled faculty member who's in trouble for something constitutionally protected speech, we might send a petition to the university in support of the faculty member, and we'll call on our supporters to sign it, and sometimes get like thousands of signatures. And it really can make a difference, because then the institution sees, okay, there are people on the other side of this, because they might be surrounded locally by only people who are saying, fire this professor, for something that's just so clearly within their academic freedom. So, yeah, there are a lot of things you can do, but those are just a couple ideas. By the way, real quick, I just want to apologize for my voice. It doesn't usually sound like this, but I did recently get over a cold, so I'm struggling a little bit, but I'll power through.
Let me know if you need another water.
Thank you.
So this is an interesting question. The person writes, you mentioned that speech is not violence, but speech can and has encouraged violence towards people, particularly marginalized people in recent history, including librarians. Can you speak to your thought on that, this idea of encouraging violence, and particularly I think around marginalized? I don't know if this is what the person is asking, but I have certainly heard the argument that speech is violence, right? Like I think you're going to say no, but what about, there's a couple questions around speech inciting violence and threatening speech.
Sure.
What's the distinction there?
Sure. So the first thing I'll note is that free speech advocates like myself don't claim that speech can never result, in some bad outcome. I mean, that would be a very silly argument to make, because then it's like, why would I be arguing for free speech in the first place if I didn't think speech was impactful in one way or the other, right? So of course, right? I mean, speech, but there is a difference between speech encouraging violence and what the Supreme Court has defined as incitement to violence or true threats. So. On the legal side of it, incitement to violence, they're both high standards. So incitement would be speech that is directed to and likely to cause imminent lawless action or violence. Think of, maybe somebody standing outside somebody's house with a mob and torches and saying, like, let's get them, right? That's probably not going to be protected speech. True threats, it's a serious expression of an intent to cause physical harm to a person. It has to be serious, genuine. It can't be a joke or whatever. So those two categories, though, they're not protected speech, right? So that's punishable. There is a line, where it crosses into an unprotected category, and the government has the authority to outlaw it. Because, the idea, like with incitement, right, is that when you've reached that point, the opportunity for debate and discussion is over. Someone's about to get hurt, so someone needs to step in. But there's a real danger with trying to move that line and make that category more expansive to include, say, encouragement of violence, because now we're getting into really vague territory where, what encourages violence? It can be applied to so much political rhetoric. I mean, if you're on the left, so I like to, do this thought experiment of how do you think if you're on the left, how do you think Donald Trump is going to define encouraging violence? Maybe Black Lives Matter protesters, that are in the streets. If you're on the right, Joe Biden's probably going to have a much different idea of what he thinks encourages violence, and the way that it gets written into laws and regulations is inevitably going to affect or reflect the biases of whoever's in power at a given moment. That's kind of always, I come back to this point all the time. Whenever you try to restrict more speech, you're giving more power to somebody. You don't know who it is yet. It's whoever's going to be in government enforcing it, to enforce it in a way that may not be in your interests. And that's always the fundamental problem with free speech, with restrictions on speech, is who decides. And I don't trust the government to decide what encourages violence.
Right, and like the law of unintended consequences, and it starts out one way. I think this is a very prescient issue right now in our town. There's a question, if there was a group to review book challenges in schools, who do you think should be a member of that group? I think we're trying to figure, a lot of folks are trying to figure this out right now.
That is a good question. I mean, I hinted at schools, the importance of schools having robust procedures and unfair procedures for reviewing book challenges. And so I think one of the things they can do is form a committee of various stakeholders. So it could include parents, teachers, librarians, a community member, maybe even a student, administrator. I think the more diversity you have on that committee, the better, so that that you minimize the risk of any one stakeholder's own biases affecting the ultimate decision. And just on that point of procedures, other things that I think schools should do is there should be a requirement that if you're raising a book challenge, you have to file a formal challenge, a written challenge. Certify that you've read the book, explain why you think it should be removed, right? The committee should get together, should review it, and I think another important point is the book should remain on the shelf while it's being reviewed, because often what you see happens is they take it off immediately, and God, my voice is really cracking right now. And then it could remain in limbo for like a year because they just never it just gets forgotten about. They never actually finish the review. And then, when they reach a decision, they should have to produce a written decision that explains the reasons for retaining, removing, or relocating the book.
We talk a bit about this here at the public library. We have a similar process. It's not as detailed maybe as has to be in the school system, but there's a process of review. There's a process of documenting concerns, and one of the provisions is you have to have read the book in its entirety.
Right.
So we see a lot of excerpts from a book or a screenshot. So actually engaging with the work and the art in its full scope.
Yeah, but it's easy to take something out of context, right?
Right.
So I think that is important.
This is an interesting question. Has fire lost any First Amendment cases? And if so, can you talk about...
No, never. Actually, we just recently did. This was a case, it was a tough case for us to bring. Oh my God, thank you so much. Thank you. We did just... We're appealing the decision, but we just had an adverse ruling in a lawsuit that we brought in Texas challenging, so it was on behalf of students at West Texas A&M University who wanted to put on a drag show at the university. The president came out and just said, no, I'm not allowing this. Well, I will never allow any kind of drag show on campus. Didn't even limit that statement to sexually explicit and shows or anything like that, just no drag. So we sued because it just obviously violates the First Amendment. And drag is a protected expression. I mean, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. I've never gone to a drag show in my life. It's you may not be your cup of tea, but it's protected expression. It's an art form. It's protected the same way that you can't tell like the Rolling Stones that they can't perform. Right, I mean, that would violate their First Amendment rights, if they're in America, at least. Writers, literature, art is protected expression. That's settled law at this point. Nevertheless, a federal judge in Texas ruled against us. But we're appealing that decision to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So hopefully we'll get it overturned, but stay tuned.
Did they give a reason, was the question?
So I'm trying not to go too much into the weeds, but so there's a doctrine called qualified immunity, which basically protects government officials from liability for violating constitutional rights unless you can show that the right was clearly established on the particular facts of the case. The judge found that the president and the other defendants in the case had benefited from qualified immunity because it wasn't a clearly established right in this particular context where it's a drag show on a college campus. And then, a lot of times courts will do that qualified immunity analysis, and then they don't have to get into the actual issue of whether or not it is a right, even if it's not a, quote, clearly established right at the time that it happened. And just to go off on a little tangent, FIRE has issues with qualified immunity as a doctrine for that reason. I mean, it really was originally developed, or it makes the most sense in the context of police officers who are acting in the heat of the moment, right? And they might have to make a split-second decision, and they might do something that's unconstitutional, but in the moment they thought it was a reasonable course of action. But it's weird to transfer that doctrine over to colleges where administrators can sit there for weeks and consult attorneys about what's lawful and isn't. But they instead just come out with a statement that says, I'm going to violate the First Amendment. He actually said in his statement, he acknowledged that it was unconstitutional. And yet still qualified immunity. So, yeah.
There's a few questions touching on social media and social media platforms specifically, and how and whether they should be allowed to publish without regulation. Can you talk a little bit about how the First Amendment applies to, Twitter and Facebook and TikTok, et cetera?
Yeah, this is a complex issue too. So social media companies are private companies, and they're engaged in publishing speech. So they have their own First Amendment rights to editorial discretion, similar to a newspaper, or a magazine, or a cable channel, right? Just because it's not your own speech doesn't mean that there isn't a First Amendment interest involved, because right, lots of newspapers will publish letters to the editor or op-eds that aren't written by anyone at the newspaper and don't necessarily reflect anyone's views at the newspaper, but the Supreme Court has established that they still have a First Amendment right to make those curation decisions. And so our FIRE's position is that that should apply to social media companies as well, because they're also engaged in publishing other speech, and they have a First Amendment right to decide, I don't want to platform this particular viewpoint or perspective. That issue is going to go up to the Supreme Court. Actually, they recently. So we'll find out. We'll get an answer once and for all on whether that's the case. But we have a nuanced position on this though, because while we recognize the legal right of social media companies to do that, we do also make a cultural argument that they shouldn't engage in viewpoint discrimination. They shouldn't discriminate against users because of their political or ideological views. Because social media companies have kind of become, right, one of the main places in society where people have public discussion about important issues. And there's only a handful of companies that kind of dominate that space. So if they all decide we're not going to have liberals views on here, we're not going to have conservative views, that can really cramp the public discourse. And this is, going back to talking about a culture of free speech. If we want a vibrant culture of free speech, then we should want social media companies to live by First Amendment values, to incorporate First Amendment standards voluntarily into their policies.
This might be top of mind because I've been watching the Floyd Abrams documentary on PBS, which is fabulous. If you haven't watched it, we're going to try to show it here at the library sometime during this series. But that the idea that the social media companies, they have a protected First Amendment right. Is that directly from Citizens United and the decision
No.
there, or that's longer than that?
It's a common misconception that Citizens United established that corporations have First Amendment rights. So you can go back to a case in the 70s, Miami Herald v. Tornillo. That established. So what happened? There was the issue in that case was there was a law that said that if a newspaper publishes like an op-ed attacking a particular politician or candidate for office, they have to have a right of reply. I think that's what it was. I hope I'm saying it accurately. It was something like that. The newspaper sued, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that that law violated the First Amendment because it violated their First Amendment right to editorial freedom. And so that's what's important, right? When people say, oh, corporations shouldn't have free speech rights, remember, media companies are corporations. You know, so when a corporation is fundamentally exists to engage in expressive activity, it probably should have First Amendment rights. You know, there are other issues going on in Citizens United about spending, and you know, and there's right, people can have good faith disagreements about campaign contribution limits and things like that. But it'd be very dangerous to. Oh, I'll give you another example for people, you know, that might appeal to people who find the argument appealing that corporations shouldn't have First Amendment rights. The Walt Disney Company, right? Their whole feud with Ron DeSantis over the past couple of years, and then you know DeSantis has retaliated against Walt Disney for coming out against his parental rights and education law. Well, if you're defending Walt Disney, you're defending a corporation's free speech rights. So then you got to defend the other ones too. You got to be consistent.
Question is, how is allowing sanitizing authors' works allowed? Like, how is that allowed? Who's allowing it? I think you touched on this a little bit, but you know, publishers, right? And is that a similar concept in terms of like these publishers? Did they have a protected First Amendment right to sanitize works? But then how does that come into conflict with the author's right not to have their books edited? I mean, that's very complicated. Whose rights are sort of privileged in these situations? The publisher or the author?
It's basically going to depend on like the terms of the contracts between authors and publishers and who has the rights to the work. Ultimately, whoever has the rights to the work by nature of the agreements that they enter into is going to be the one who has the right to. The holder
of the
rights. I mean, they do. You know, if they're a publisher or an estate of an author like Roald Dahl, and you have the rights to the work, you do have a right to make those changes. But again, there's a difference between what you have the right to do and what you should do. And I would argue that making posthumous changes to a dead author's work is just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong, I think. You know, especially, you know, unless you have like real clear evidence that this is what they would have wanted you to do. And it's, you know, it's sanitizing history too, right? I mean, every book is ultimately, even every novel is ultimately a history book too. It's a reflection of the time in which it was written, and it can teach you valuable things, you know, about that time. And you know, if there's stuff in there that you consider problematic, that's all well and good. That could be good fodder for a discussion amongst people who are reading the book. But to go back and make edits to it is just there's a term for that, right? Bowdlerization. That came from someone named Thomas Bowdler, who in the 19th century did this to all sorts of books that he considered to be, you know, immoral. He was a real Anthony Comstock type character, right? Going back and editing things that he thought was immoral or obscene or what have you. Editing Shakespeare, there's a whole edition of Shakespeare, Thomas Bowdler's Shakespeare, with all the good stuff taken out of it. So.
This is a question about why do you think so many colleges have become so resistant to free speech? That seems is that a new trend? Is that something that's new in our American history? And what's that about?
Well, I wouldn't say it's entirely new, but it's kind of maybe been in waves over the past few decades. You know, one root of it is in the 1980s. There were, I'm going to use the term critical race theory here, which I know is like controversial, but there actually are critical race theorists that exist. And there were a prominent few of them in the 1980s who advanced these arguments about why we should restrict certain offensive speech that discriminate or targets or is about minorities, because in their view, it's that type of speech inflicts a sort of harm in and of itself, like racist speech, for example. And that argument actually gained traction, and a lot of universities in the 1980s started adopting speech codes that would ban things like racial harassment. But the problem was that they would often define these terms very vaguely, and again, that's always ultimately the issue, is that, just to give an example, if you're making, one of the longest running debates on campus is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And here all the time, one side will be criticizing Israel, but will be accused of engaging in anti-Semitic speech. And then the other side, will maybe be criticizing Palestinian terrorism, and that will get called racist. And maybe those accusations are plausible sometimes, maybe they're not, but it's going to be enforced in unpredictable ways, and usually ways that again reflect the biases of whoever happens to be in power. And that's always ultimately kind of the problem with these hate speech regulations. Now, actual harassment, by the way, can be punished, just to be clear. Like, if you're, it's a high standard for a reason, so that you're not also sweeping in Constitution-protected speech. But, the standard is speech that is severe, pervasive, objectively offensive, and actually has the effect of depriving a student of their access to their education. Okay, we can do something, we can intervene there. But too often it's just applied to just political speech, political viewpoints that aren't popular. So that's where some of it comes from, and that's kind of been revived. My boss, Fire CEO Greg Lukianoff, often talks about that he says that students were actually pretty good on campus speech up until around 2014, and something changed around that time. And he also wrote a whole book called Coddling of the American Mind, which is about how we are teaching young people really unhealthy mental habits, like the opposite of cognitive behavioral therapy, where you actually catastrophize things and you view the world in black and white, right? And you view it as a Manichaean battle between good and evil people. And when you engage in when you have that type of mindset, it's pretty conducive to censorship. Because what happens is you end up sort of dehumanizing the people you disagree with, or seeing them as such an immediate, catastrophic threat that it's justified to shut down their freedoms, shut down their freedom of speech. And we've also seen, the proliferation of concepts like microaggressions on campus, where it's just even unintentional perceived slights can be the basis for punishing people. So that's where a lot of it comes from, But I don't want to only single out, the left. I mean, I talked about the Stop Woke Act, right? I mean, the certain Republican state legislatures have been doing really bad work. Trying to restrict, imposing curricular bans and what faculty members are able to talk about in the classroom. So that's part of it too. And I think part of it is these things play off of each other, right? One side engages in censorship, and the other side, instead of saying, hey, wait, let's stick to the fundamental liberal values that benefit all of us, say, okay, now I'm going to censor you, even worse. And then it just becomes this, this spiral that's tough to get out of.
Like you said, this increase in polarization in our country is leading to this equal increase in censorship. And my fear is that things are going to get worse before they get better, particularly as we move into a new presidential election cycle. Is that fair?
That's totally fair. Sometimes I'm optimistic about where things are going. That I don't want to make it sound all doom and gloom. There are, you'll see positive developments. There have been college presidents recently who have taken a really strong stand for free speech in the face of controversy, and that's hugely important because it can really set the tone on campus. For example, the Stanford Law Dean Jenny Martinez. Many of you might know about this controversy, made national news when federal judge Kyle Duncan went to Stanford Law to speak, and a lot of students showed up to protest him because of his views on transgender rights and gay rights and some of the rulings that he had given from the bench. But it it went from protest to actually shouting him down, and he wasn't able to get his prepared remarks out, which, you know, again, that's not, at that point, it's not legitimate protest. It's you're preventing other people from being able to exercise their free speech rights and the students' rights who came to listen to him actually speak and maybe ask him tough questions, right?
Right, like you said, like actually
Yeah.
hold his feet to the fire.
It's like you're a federal
right?
judge doesn't come to your law school
Right, let's
every day.
grill him.
This is your one opportunity to tell him face why he's so full of shit. If that's what you think, like, take that opportunity, because you're not going to have it again. You know, but, you know, what was the question?
Well, that was great.
Oh, yeah, so she came out, the law dean, with this just ringing endorsement of free speech, 10 pages long. Like, it's something that Fire could have written, honestly. And it was just great to see. And now she's recently actually been promoted to provost of Stanford, of the entire university, which is great. And, you know, it shows a commitment on the part of the school to those values. So I think that's really something important that schools can do. They should also take a no-tolerance policy towards students or other people stopping speaking events from happening. So that's like one positive development. You know, there's other things I can name, you know, like going back to the private sector, you know, Netflix is very pro-free speech. Their CEO, Ted Sarandos, when there was a big controversy when when they aired Dave Chappelle's special a year or two ago, huge outcry from their own staff and from a lot of other people. And, you know, it's just so refreshing to see a company like that actually stand firm in the face of those protests and say no, you know. And they actually added an artistic expression statement to their internal, you know, culture memo that says, we respect artistic freedom. We strive to serve a diverse audience with a variety of views and perspectives, and people can make their own decisions about what they think is appropriate or what they want to watch. So, you know, when you see things like that, it makes you feel good. But you're right, the election's going to be a show, and I do worry about that just making polarization worse. And, you know, like I said, when we get more polarized, it tends not to be good news for free speech.
But it's nice to hear some good news and people standing firm and in their principles and having the courage to, and having the courage to stand, you know, and defend things even that they personally don't enjoy, agree with. I mean, we do it every day here at the library. I often say there's plenty of books on our shelves that I personally don't enjoy. I find distasteful, even offensive, but it's not, you know, Kira Parrott's personal library. It's for the entire community, and there's lots of reasons that people need access to a variety of ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, and I think it's even more important and powerful when people defend the rights of speakers that they disagree with. You know, I like taking cases at Fire where I don't agree with the person's views, because then I know I'm really committed to the principle. And, you know, faculty, too, at colleges, I think, you know, some are doing a better job of standing up these principles. I think many tenured faculty especially, when you have the protections of tenure, I think you really have a responsibility to stand up and defend the academic freedom and free speech of your peers, especially when you disagree with them. And I wish more of them would do that. And, you know, there's other things faculty can do, organizing faculty committees and putting people on hiring committees who believe in free speech, academic freedom, and not, you know, imposing ideological litmus tests or discriminating against people for their views. So, yeah, there's a lot that they can be doing, too.
Well, thank you so much. I do want to make sure we all have time to enjoy some refreshments and wine outside. Thank you so much, Aaron. This was really enlightening.
Thank you.